the agency's reliance on the polygraph in this case had changed your mind about the utility of the tool in the context of employee source screenings.
Who is reporting this polygraph?
The UK Times Online.
UK Times. That's what used to be the London Times, or
Yes, I believe so.
different publication?
I don't know.
Whatever. Anyway, when we talked some months ago, as you remember, I expressed very strong skepticism about the utility of the polygraph used on a mass basis, and but said I was open to the idea of using it the way the Bureau historically used it, which was as a tool in investigation in which one had a limited number of suspects and wanted to ascertain which one of several people might be lying about something. I still draw that distinction, but I think I would add, first of all, I don't know whether the UK Times is right. I don't know whether a polygraph was used in this case. And if there was one used, I don't know whether it was given by the Americans or the Jordanians. So there are a lot of imponderables here. But one of the things one needs to be careful of is cultural differences between the polygrapher and the subject. Polygraphers often base some of their judgments, anyway, on observing people and picking up cues. There are a number of cues that, for a lot of people, not everybody, go along with lying. Certain body postures and ways of using your hands and expressions and so forth that are not clear indicators, but are more data for an experienced individual to assess, and sometimes those are very different from one culture to another. Take something as simple as in Greece, nodding your head vigorously up and down means no. There are all sorts of things that can be misread from one culture to another. But as I said, we don't know whether this, A, there was a polygraph, and B, if there was one, it was given by the Jordanians or by the Americans. But something one would have to be careful of would be cultural differences, not picking up cues, or people being less likely to register on the poly because of cultural differences. There are certain aspects of one's state of mind that contribute to causing a problem on a poly. And I think when you and I talked, I gave you the example of the extremely proper and religious woman who I knew about, who would send the poly off the charts if you asked her, as they did, if she'd ever committed a terrible crime, and they would zero down, and it would ask her about sex crimes, and it would be difficult to find an individual less likely to commit a sex crime than this woman. But she had been a prosecutor, a prosecuting attorney, and had tried several terrible sex crime cases, and the thinking about it so appalled her that she would get nervous and upset, even though she had certainly never committed one. And the poly would indicate that she was not telling the truth. And by the same token, there are people who can, either because they're sociopaths or whatever, can lie with great aplomb and great ease and not be picked up on a poly. Rick Ames famously passed 2 CIA polys. So when you're dealing with a large group of people, you have a possibility of a lot of false positives. When you're dealing with a small group of people, like an individual that may be visiting one of several people that might visit someplace, it may be useful to have a poly done, but it ought to be, I think, only one of a range of things that are looked at. People who are familiar with the culture of the individual being examined ought to be involved if it's a serious and important matter, etc. So, I don't have any different view of poly than I did before, but I think even when you're using it in a limited number of cases, there are certainly dangers and risks in relying on it too heavily. I think maybe, did I tell you the story that I had heard about the polygrapher who got the initial indication from someone he was polygraphing about the location of Saddam Hussein in Iraq?
Yes, you did, and that he
well,
failed.
That was a case in which the polygrapher had the good sense to rely on his judgment of years of questioning people as a polygrapher,
right,
but to ignore the poly's results itself and say, I think this guy is telling the truth, even though he's failing the poly. And it can work the other way around, too. So experienced polygraphers used to dealing with the culture of the individual in question, partially because of their judgment and partially because they may get some assistance in some circumstances from the poly itself, seem to me to be one potential important, useful ingredient in the mix of things one does in terms of trying to preserve security and who visits what facility and so forth. But the thing that is, I think, always a bad idea is treating the poly like Wonder Woman's magic lasso and assume that it's just that it's a quote lie detector, and if someone triggers it, they're lying. If they don't trigger it, they're telling the truth. That's really I think most dangerous.
Okay, so I guess what was confusing me was that if you would be willing to say we shouldn't polygraph at all, the CIA shouldn't polygraph in pre-employment screenings, because these are large groups of people, you're going to get a huge number of false positives. If the error rate is the same, and the number of people you're using the tool on is smaller when you're using it among other tools to assess the risk of sources in the field, why would you use a tool with the same error rate that you would dismiss in a less important context?
I'm not sure there is the same error rate. I think if one is talking about, let's say, the way the Bureau used to use it, may still, as far as I know, I don't know if they use it for pre-employment screening now or not. I haven't kept up with it, but back years ago, the Bureau would only use it with a very limited number of people who were suspects, I think, in the same crime. And an element of judgment, an element of whether the person performed well or badly on the poly, element of assessing and the polygrapher becoming familiar with the facts of the case, etc., that I had just had a number of people tell me who had knew about the use of the poly in those circumstances to say it's probably of more help than harm, although you can't completely trust it. But you would want to look into what that National Academy of Sciences study says about that type of use of the poly. I don't really recall exactly what it says, but I don't know that the high false positive rate is or high rate of false hits is the same when you're talking about polygraphing 4 people as it is when you're talking about polygraphing thousands. And in any case, if you have a false positive in a criminal investigation, the polygraph itself is not evidence. So what that does is it probably makes you look at the person who failed the poly more carefully and look into other aspects of a potential case against him more carefully. But it's not a consequence in and of itself the way it is when you say, okay, Woolsey, you failed your poly, so you can't become an employee of the CIA. If Woolsey is one of 4 people being investigated for a specific crime, and Woolsey fails his poly and the other people pass, they will have to and should probably zero in more on what Woolsey did and to look into doubly and trebly checking where he was at 9:30 p.m. on Thursday, the 21st of March, et cetera, et cetera. But they can't convict you of a crime based on failing a poly. It's not admissible. So the consequences are that you might get with a false positive. You might get increased scrutiny, but that's not the same thing as it causing a specific action by the government, it seems to me, which is what happens when you use it on a mass basis.
Okay. In terms of the cultural, potential subcultural, cultural, and racial biases or differences across subgroups, well, I guess this is something that I'm having trouble figuring out how to address in the documentary, because you are the 4th person that I have had mention this, and I find it problematic in the sense that, I want to either find out, okay, is this a tool that has a systematic racial bias that some department...
Well, I don't know that it's racial. I think but I think there probably are differences from culture to culture with respect to some aspects of veracity, and more importantly, I think, the non-polygraph cues that one can read. Look, I grew up I'm a WASP, and I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. If I were a polygrapher, I'd have probably a better feel for Southwestern Americans of my generation and whether they're telling the truth or not, and how to modulate a poly, than I would someone who spoke a different language and was from a completely different part of the world, and for whom nodding meant no. It doesn't. I don't think the key thing is what color the skin is. It's a culture and a way of expressing and a way of mannerisms and so forth. And it's. I think good polygraphers don't always believe the poly. Sometimes they go with their judgment, or one of those modulates the other, and that judgment is something that it's much harder to exercise if you're not familiar with the culture. Now, I've lived 4 years of my life in Germany, or Austria. My German was once passable. It wasn't great. But if I had stayed with that and lived for a chunk of my life in Germany and my German were fluent, I'd have a lot better feel, I think, if I were a polygrapher, to pick up cues and that kind of thing from a German that I was examining than, say, a Frenchman. That had anything to do with race. It has to do with culture and mannerisms and expressions and so forth.
Right. So when you talk about culture, you're not even necessarily making any assumptions about, a particular construction of truth, or.
Well, some cultures do have a different standard depending on who you're talking to. I mean, look up the Arabic word taqiyya. It means lying to infidels, and it's kind of okay. Okay, and it doesn't mean that all people from that culture are going to lie, but there is, you don't have an expression in English that means a word in common use that means lying to non-English speakers or lying to non-Westerners. And there are some cultural and linguistic differences on these issues, and they manifest themselves sometimes in different ways. Some people from a Mideastern culture might be absolutely welcoming and absolutely candid and absolutely protective of you if you are a guest or has come into their tent, in a sense. Have you read 3 Cups of Tea?
No.
Well, it's the book about the mountain climber who got lost coming down K2 and ends up in this very primitive Pakistani village and is taken in. It changes everything. I mean, he builds school and ends up building girls' schools for them, and so it's a marvelous story. But the point is, if that guy had come in one guise, he might well have been regarded as an infidel enemy. The way he came, he was taken in as and probably treated better than most any other culture would have treated him as a lost individual who needed help. It's not that one culture always lies more than another. It's that there are different styles and standards of behavior in different circumstances in different cultures, and it's hard to read somebody with or without a poly if the more unfamiliar you are with the culture.
Okay, so if equal...
I mean, I almost, quite literally, one time missed jumping onto a Greek ferry and almost fell into very dangerous water because I asked the guy, it was starting to pull away, and I asked the guy on the other side if it was still okay to climb across, and he nodded vigorously, and so I started, and happily somebody grabbed me and pulled me back because by nodding vigorously he meant no. Okay. I did not read him very well. And I damn near fell 20 feet into very deep water because I didn't read him well. It was a dangerous misreading. It was an understandable misreading. All my life, people nodding mean yes. And indeed, I think nodding means yes probably in countries surrounding Greece, but that's not what it means to a Greek. Wow. It means no.
Wow.
And if you try to, do a poly on somebody, and multiply that by hundreds. What does a shrug mean? What does a wince mean? What do your eyes wide open and a friendly smile mean? They can mean different things in different cultures, and it's hard to understand that without being familiar with it. So I'm not saying I don't know if this guy were polyed, or if so, who did it. But all I'm saying is that you can't, even in circumstances where the poly may be of some assistance, and I think they're fairly limited, you certainly do not want to take it as gospel or as as a lie detector. It is not the magic lasso.
Right. Okay. And in terms of equal opportunity law protecting people from discrimination on the basis of nationality, national origin. If that applied to CIA hiring, obviously the polygraph wouldn't be, it wouldn't be utilized. So why doesn't?
Well, I don't know.
The CIA hiring.
If I am, well, first of all, you have national. You got to be an American citizen to be an agency employee, but the United States has people who have been citizens for brief periods of time, and people who've been citizens back for centuries in their family, and that people from all sorts of different countries and cultures in the world who are American citizens, and clearly they should not be discriminated against on the basis of national origin in a sense. But if I need native Arabic speakers, because I'm going from, and I think this is probably the case, because I'm going from a Cold War world in which one operates usually as a case officer under official cover. One is masquerades as, say, a Treasury Department official or something like that, whereas in fact you're a CIA officer trying to recruit spies. Going from that world to the world of non-official cover officers, NOCs. A non-official cover officer has to pretend to be and be believed to be somebody who is either indigenous to the country or somebody who is something other than an American and naturally and understandably in the country. Otherwise, if there's any flaw in that, they could well be detected, and if they were picked up, they don't get just declared persona non grata and sent back to Langley to teach language courses or something. They're killed perhaps horribly. So being a non-official cover officer means that you have to be able to blend in to the culture you're operating in far more completely than is the case for official cover officers. So if I interpreted the non-discrimination way in such a way as to say, well, I need a spy in Syria, but it is fine for me to, I have to regard young Syrian Americans exactly the same way I would regard young Americans who were Native Americans from Tierra del Fuego or Norwegian, born in Norway. My Tierra del Fuegan American or my Norwegian American is sure as the devil not going to pass as a normal citizen of Syria. I'd bloody well better find somebody who looks, acts, sounds, and speaks fluently Syrian accented Arabic. Otherwise, I'm sending them to their death.
Right.
So, you know, if the cover requirements for the CIA, and this is kind of a unique CIA thing, it's not necessarily the case for a lot of other government agencies. It kind of doesn't matter if you're, say, an IRS agent or whatever, but if you're a case officer of the CIA, an awful lot of being able to blend in enters into that decision. Now, that is not necessarily the question at all for the science and technology people at the CIA, for the management people, or for the analysts even. Although a lot of analysts will do a better job analyzing what's going on in the country if they're thoroughly familiar with not just the language, but the culture and so forth. A Syrian American would probably be able better to understand what's going on when he reads an article in a Syrian newspaper or a report from a debriefing of a spy in Syria than somebody who had just studied Arabic but was not familiar with the culture. So I guess I'd say for management and science and technology, nationality and culture probably don't really matter at all and shouldn't. For analysts, it could be one element. For a case officer under official cover, doesn't really matter, I don't think. For a case officer under non-official cover, it could be absolutely vital as a criterion on whether somebody gets hired.
Right. I've heard of so many cases of people being asked questions that were specific to their background that, you know, whether or not they were appropriate for the purposes of security briefing clearly, or security screening, clearly did violate equal opportunity law. And it's been the agency's response to these complaints that equal opportunity law doesn't apply to them.
Well, we had as did most government agencies back in the 80s and early 90s when I was there, we had a glass ceiling case by a case officer, class action. And I determined after some months of looking at this that she had some very good points, and we settled the case on very close to what she was asking for. But you've had, I'm sure you've had both, probably more in the past than in the present, but you've certainly had, I'm sure, not just the agency, but a lot of government agencies, discrimination against women and against minorities. But the CIA is, in terms of this cultural business and cover and so forth, is a very different place than a lot of other government agencies.
Right.
If you want to be an IRS agent, it shouldn't make a damn bit of difference whether you're a Syrian American or a Norwegian American or a Tierra del Fuego Indian American. But case officer under non-official cover at the CIA, it may well matter a lot.
So it might make sense to say that equal opportunity law needs to apply to other governmental agencies in pre-employment and hiring practices, but not to the CIA.
Well, no, I mean, I think, as I said, I think there's a difference between different parts of the CIA. I think equal opportunity, it depends on what you mean by equal opportunity law. There has to be some sensible way to permit Syrian Americans to be hired to be spies under non-official cover in Syria, and to have favoritism shown toward them if that's what the Near East Division needs, rather as distinct from, say, Norwegian Americans. Right. On the other hand, the head of science and technology at the CIA, I would think there's no reason at all that they ought to be permitted to or want to favor,